Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming out tonight. The crowd has multiplied in short order, so I'm happy about that. Alex used up some of what I was going to say in the intro. I may have to repeat a little bit of it out of just to make sure I use my time up. But thank you to Alex, too, for inviting me. So when people typically ask me what it is I do, the answer I give is sculptural photography. And more specifically, the primary subject of my work is the built environment. And for me, that includes things like some of what Alex mentioned, architectural surfaces and materials, building materials, signage, sort of all the things that I think of as sort of backdrops and support structures for the world we move through, including the digital one to a degree. And in the last 5+ years or so, I've been really playing with how to represent this using a range of technologies, some of which, again, Alex mentioned. But that includes things like 3D scanning, 3D printing, vacuum forming, which is what we see here, CNC milling, UV printing, as well as some installation work using large vinyl wraps and some site-specific sculptures. And I'll explain some of what we're seeing in more detail. I just sort of wanted to show these as kind of a larger overview. My goal in creating this work is sort of never to do a one-to-one or trompe-l'oeil recreation, but to use fragmentation and intensification to create work that is optically tactile and has an emotional and surreal punch beyond just the initial recreation of the work. And some of these, like I said, I'll revisit. But one of the things I wanted to sort of talk about as a framing of what I do, and I was inspired by some earlier talks I saw here, is early life influences and some of the education that I think, as I try to reverse engineer my own decisions, I think have played a role. So this is my little family collage I made. My mom sent me a few photos. But there's a few things on here that I think worth mentioning. One is my lovely parents up there in all their youthful glory, who are both artists. And early on, we all lived in the mountains of Virginia on a commune with no running water or no electricity. And I've often kind of joked that I've experienced the Industrial Revolution firsthand, which is relatively true, in the sense that we progressively moved into increasingly urban areas, and in each step along the way, I think I was sensitive to the changes, both the cultural and the built environment around me. Also, I think one thing that I really love about these photos, these are two houses my father built when we were out there. If I can zoom in here. That's me handing my dad some nails. And I think that just this sort of early impression of the fact that you could build a space sort of in the middle of nowhere and create a world from scratch was really influential on me. I just need to zoom out. Whoops. Now I've broken it. Hold on. There we go. Also, like I mentioned, both my parents are artists, and my mother is a painter and my father's a ceramicist. And the plasticity of both of those mediums was also really something that I absorbed and was inspiring, this idea that you could take a liquid form and crystallize it into something solid. And also, I think something about the fact of kind of splitting the difference between the illusionistic mode of painting and this kind of sculptural way of building pottery really influenced me. This is me giving it a try at the bottom there. Unsurprisingly, given the background I just described, I think two other big influences for me in terms of shaping my young inner world were psychedelics and Zen meditation. And I don't know that I'm a professional at either, but I've definitely dabbled heavily. And I recognize there's an element of humor in that, but I think there's something about it that was really lasting. And when it comes to, I think both, what they have in common is, for me, there is an imperative in each to pay attention to the specific and to really look carefully at the details of my life and the things that surround me. With psychedelics, for anyone who's done them before, you know this, the background and the peripheral is brought to the foreground in a pretty radical way. And these kind of experiences where the visual world becomes unstable or becomes a sort of place of non-logical depth and space is something that left a really lasting impression and stayed with me. Paradoxically, along those same lines, while you're drawn to the surface, there's also this kind of unmooring or apprehension about what lies behind appearances, I think, which is an extremely important path that I was set on, exploring those things. Similarly with Zen, it has this kind of twinning that I think is interesting. On one level, practices encourage you to pay attention to your breath, your body, the space you're in. At the same time, it's based on a set of principles that say that, what you think you are is an illusion, and the world around you is not as it seems. And so I think the two of them in combination at a very young age, what seems like a very young age now, had a really lasting impact. And there was a sort of twinning of this idea of both empirical observation and ontological doubt that has stayed with me in a pretty productive way. As for artistic influences, I think like a lot of kids of the provinces, I experienced art largely through commercial sources and photographic reproduction. So there's a lot of comic books, graphic novels, commercial design, and then artwork is seen in photography. So two of my many early influences were Carol Dunham and Philip Guston. And I think they both, what I liked about both of them is they had a sort of comic or vulgar humanism where they were using some of the languages of graphic communication to speak about existential issues and a certain irony as well as vulnerability. Other artists, especially when I went to grad school and beyond, that influenced me were people like, and I guess I got a little pointer here, Peter Halley, Rachel Harrison, Richard Archschwager, and John Davola. And I think they're very disparate artists, but what they have in common is a hybrid approach to what they do. There's a blending in most cases of photography and architecture, or painting and sculpture, or installation and photography. And also, I like the way that in each of their cases, it's a heavily material practice, but it's one that uses materiality not as a sort of matter of fact, but as an imaginative leap. That whether that's leads into metaphor of some time, cultural theory, an anxiety about materials in Archschwager's case, or almost a performance element in Davola. I just like that there's a sort of a new synthesis created in all that work. I like this infographic. I was just talking to Alex about this before, and lately I've been increasingly aware of the fact that myself and sort of other people in roughly my age bracket are part of a really abridged generation. And I think this also has informed my work and a lot of my peers as well. And the significance seems to be twofold to me. One is that we were all, I'm thinking people anywhere from late 30s to mid 40s or so, essentially people who were young enough to remember before the internet and before the digital kind of became a dominant media, but also young enough at the time when it arrived to adopt it. And I think that is one significant fact. And another is this sort of relationship to high modernist forms, processes, materials, which I think is due to the fact that most of the people who educated us were our parents' age, who are also sort of part of that world. And I've just noticed lately, especially as my own work and my peers' work evolves and seeing the work of younger artists, there is sort of a really interesting and distinctive space that's being occupied where artists I think are trying to take some of those, that use of materiality that's transparent and immediate and tie it into some of the affect and tactility of the digital space. Oh, by the way, I asked Alex about this. If you guys want to interrupt me with questions at any point, I'm happy to be interrupted. So if that comes up, don't be shy. So as far as my early work, this is me at my thesis show with an unfortunate orange sweater. But I still like the work behind me. This work was made using carved styrofoam, resin, paint, wood. They're very sculpturally made, but I still look at them and think of them as being, sort of indebted to the worlds of abstraction and of painting. Abstraction in the sense that although they combine a lot of disparate sources like cartooning, graphic design, outdoor signage, they're all, no one source becomes explicit. They're all sort of integrated into a new whole. And painting in the sense that they are, sort of compressed underneath color and paint. They're not, they're not sort of showing their disparate materials the same way they're not sort of announcing any individual part. So for instance, with a piece like this, I was thinking of aerial maps and street signage and sort of, funky figuration. There's some vacuum forming going on too, which is something I pick up later. These little pieces down here are like crumpled vacuum forms. There was a small little vacuum former at the architecture school nearby. Some of these were, sort of, again, a little bit tongue-in-cheek plays with icons and street signage. These are all made out of paint, so these are all surfaces I was sort of building up and collaging with thick layers of paint. It's also doing a little bit in the way of installation and installing these in a way that sort of responded to the site they were in. And at a certain point, I got more interested in being explicit with a sort of material literalism. And so for a brief period, or a year or two, I played around with objects like this, where the materiality was literal. And I thought about sort of taking materials from my sources rather than synthesizing them. So kind of going out into the world, finding things and building from there. This was much, much crappier than it looks in the photo, which was sort of the point. It was like a beat up, bad IKEA chunk / Ellsworth Kelly. But photography, which can work for and against you, has made this look elegant. These are some pieces made with Formica, and I think at the time I was thinking about materials that are also imitations in and of themselves. So Formica imitating marble. So the materials are sort of providing their own illusion. I did hit a place with that where I felt, these are sort of the permutations post-grad school and trying to shake off my own education, where I felt like they were still too much indebted to painting, that I was using compositional tropes and techniques that I had learned. And I got interested in trying to, move away from both compositional choices and even the space of painting, and to think more about material juxtapositions. So this is a shot from my first show, solo show at the Suburban, which is a space run by Michelle Grabner in Chicago. And I drove all these out in a van overnight, which was horrible. But these are all cinder blocks covered in plasticine. And so what I did, it's a small exhibition space that's 16 feet by 8. And so I've divided it in half with these cinder blocks, covered the walls in, zoom ahead for a second, in lorem ipsum text, which is like a dummy filler text that graphic designers use to mock up a page. And I also covered the floor in white tiles. And this idea of doubling really animated the show. I was interested in the room kind of bisected and inaccessible, and the materials, the literal cinder blocks kind of being confused as to what they even were, that this plasticine would confuse how heavy they were or what they were made of. Michelle was also kind enough to let me cut a hole in her wall in the shape of the door, so there's this kind of double door, both a usable door and a non-usable door. And this was her garage. It was great. You could. So I like this. Again, there's this idea of I was working more with literal materiality, and if there were any illusions, the illusions were more kind of metaphorical or suggestive rather than visual or optical. I also like the fact that something that came up in later work with kind of proximity and resolution, that from a distance the text looked convincing, but as you got closer it broke down into nonsense. These are some other sculptures I made. And with all of these, one of the thoughts was, A, sculpture that was very planar, but B, sculpture that was more of about a framing of space or blocking of space than an image to be looked at properly. This was at Marlborough Gallery, and these are colored plasticine between cinder blocks. But I did, in all seriousness, get tired of moving cinder blocks around. And also, I think I missed what was really good to me about painting, where a lot of my instincts lay. And that was just this play with illusionism, like actual illusionism, and not sort of the more conceptual variety. And so I started to think about photography again. I'd always been using photography as source material. I had this huge archive of different photographic sources, but they always felt secondary. And I also had always felt, I think, a bias towards photography as being overly hermetic. It's all one surface, it's all behind the glass. It's usually small, it doesn't have a material presence. But I started to think that if there was ways I could use newer technologies or more commercial forms of reproduction, I could give some of that tactility and presence that I wanted. So one of the things I hit on was using large commercial printers that print on flatbed surfaces. So you can run these, sheets through these things, and they'll print on wood or things that can't go into a roll material. And then I also started using larger scale vacuum forming. This is a little video. See if it works. And basically, this is at a set shop in Midtown Manhattan. And what's happening is it's heating up a large sheet that I've printed on, and you can see it's like 12 feet long. It's actually, the shop does television sets. So these were often used to make backdrops for TVs, which I thought was a nice connection, that they were made for the camera, and I was trying to take images and make them more sculptural. But you can see it sucks down around these molds that I've made to produce sort of textured imagery. And it smells terrible too. This is always, I might have to jump out from. It's like a giant heater. Yeah. So it's like, yeah, exactly. It's like a giant, I don't know if I can scroll this video. Videos and PDFs are not super stable. But yeah, so basically there's 3 layers. There's the mold, there's the photo, and there's a giant heater. And the heater kind of melts the plastic till it's soft, and then it sucks down around the mold. And so there's this kind of photographic exposure quality that I always found really beautiful. And also, I like this idea that the imagery is a sort of shell. The mold is destroyed in the process, and the imagery is almost like a wrapping or a package. Yeah, I don't know how to scroll back, sorry. There we go. And I just wanted to show this brief, largely what I was using for my molds were ceiling tiles, plaster, cardboard. And these were useful both as conveniences. They were lightweight and cheap, but I also liked the way that they sort of had a metaphorical rhyming with images of concrete, which was largely what I was photographing. They are infrastructural. They cover wiring in the ceiling. Concrete covers the wiring in the street, top, bottom, inside out. And also, of course, they have this kind of mimetic play where a lot of the stone texture of ceiling tiles kind of rhymes with the quasi-stone of concrete. And so these are some of the first vacuum forms I did that I was happy with using that process. Another thing that appealed to me with this was just this idea of making images that sort of felt like other images in the world, that I was almost backdrafting on technologies that were being funded by somebody else, using the tail end of them. But I think, more importantly, just that felt, that had the texture and even the methods of production like things I would encounter outside of an art-specific context. And the same thing that drew me to some of this subject matter, that also appealed, that it would not feel beholden necessarily to any one tradition, but would feel of a certain moment, have some of the affect of that moment. A lot of the imagery was things like this, which is one of these grates in the sidewalk that opens up, or grates like this. And I was interested in sort of things that we knew intellectually or from experience to be openings, even as much as they were surfaces. So this idea of a sort of dead end that was also an acknowledgement of a world beneath the surface. This is another grate that had been painted. I was playing a little bit with installation too. This is an installation at an art fair. This is sort of freestanding wall with some things hanging on it. And also playing around with shaped frames and sort of stacking and building these forms sculpturally. And another thing that occurred to me as I was making these that I liked was the sense of a sort of deferred touch too, that I think has something in the world of like the haptics of a screen, where we're used to touching our devices and rubbing them and getting fingerprints on them and having an intimacy with the imagery, but at the same time it's all under glass. And I like the fact that even though these were gestural and expressive, all that happened below the surface. This is about 8 feet tall for scale. And this is a good example. This is marking delineated for parking, and then these are graffiti marks that are made to show where wiring is below the surface. So I sort of like the multi-axis that's showing you how to dig and also how to move across the surface. But then when it's hung on the wall, it kind of gives it a different gravity. Around, as I was working with this, I also did a residency where I was given access to NYU's digital media studios, and I got interested in 3D printing and scanning. And for me, that was interesting for a few reasons. I mean, one, I just liked what we're sort of seeing here, which is that you could take specific information from a photograph and use that to create sculptural depth. So I'm using the height map. You know, it's very basic, and I got to say, I'm maybe as a compared to other people who have lectured here, I'm very much an end-level user and a acknowledged one in the sense that I've often been interested in getting things that are sort of consumer-ready as opposed to writing code for myself. I like the idea of that certain accessibility or recognizability. So height maps are nothing exciting for a lot of people, but for me they were cool enough. But I also liked the just this sort of like both the misunderstandings that could occur, but also the literalization, where in some cases it would get it right and make a groove. In other cases, a shadow would become a shape it wasn't supposed to be. So this is a photograph that's then given a height map, and these could be printed out. The other thing I got into, which is I think even more interesting, was 3D scanning. And this seemed almost like a funny extension of how I had always thought of photography, which is just a way to grab something from the world, whole, as opposed to composing it piece by piece. The photo. I think Luigi Ghiri, who's a great photographer, said that the photo is its own formal action. You take it and it's done. And so I like the idea of 3D scanning in a similar sense. This is me 3D scanned, in the sense that it was a way to kind of take something in a somewhat impersonal manner and have it whole. There's me with some tiles. And I started scanning things that I might even use in my vacuum form. So I was scanning ceiling tiles and detritus that was coming out of the studio. And just these are some process shots. These are not the actual printer I use, but they're the same basic idea, where these things are printed in powder prints, which I think is really interesting because it's meant for prototypes. It's sort of small and flimsy, which is its limitation, but what it has going for it is that you can print color and form at the same time. And it's sort of, it's made, I think, largely for like toy makers or gadget manufacturers to sort of see like a life scale version of a small object. But for me, I got interested in scanning some of these building materials and also combining them in ways that were sort of either absurdist or unlikely. So this was a scan of one of these fake foam flagstone walls with a light switch embedded in it. This is a little video. Just you can sort of get a sense of the space this thing operates in. These videos I always found sort of beautiful and relaxing. Right? Let's see if I can get out of this again. Of course I can't. Hold on. I'm sure there's a way to do it, but. All right. This is another one, just as an example. And another thing that really interested me about the 3D printing that was unique to it is that you could really kind of have a much more dynamic relationship of image and texture and form. Whereas with the flatbed printing, it's sort of unidirectional, as is the vacuum forming. It's sort of based on gravity and linear direction of ink. With the 3D printing, you can wrap objects in different ways. You can project onto them. You can also extrude information out based on the value. So with this, for instance, a good example where this was a piece of scrap of styrofoam I found near a building site where I extruded the graphic design information out of it, but then wrapped a photo I had scanned of a crumpled piece of marbleized paper that Formica gave as a sample. So trace down that level of imitation. It's sort of a rabbit hole. But I just liked that there were these possibilities for unusual combinations like that were less linear. This is an installation of some of these small pieces at Halsey McKay Gallery. And these were all similar, like small building scraps. And I would do things like repeat the same scan with different information. So this was a scan of a Home Depot box, and I extruded out different graphics, then repeated it again with a photograph printed on it. I was also into this, these imagery of things like light sockets and outlets and ports, both as a pragmatic way to hang them. You can just screw them through the holes, but also as another way to sort of acknowledge a surface unseen. When we see a light switch, we know there's something back there, but our bodies can't access it. So I like that there's a sort of mental abstraction. This is another one I did, sort of inspired by all these buildings I see in New York, where there's these stages where they're sort of wrapped in graphic design. I think it's this kind of poignant, amazing moment that it's all going to be covered up, and then the design will start being dated and aged, and they'll change the logos, but that's like a time capsule inside inside of the building. And so I thought of this as almost like creating a design out of it. This is like a proposal for an architect almost, where the logo, the information is extruded through the letters, or through the stones rather. This is also one of the workarounds I came up with for the small size. This is tiled together in different pieces. And you get a kind of a cool sense of how the imagery wraps around forms. Yes. Yeah, so I recreated the logos. They're actually bootlegs. There's like little dumb jokes. I would change the typefaces around. But yeah, so basically the logo is extruded, as a height map through the stone, or depressed rather through this into the stone. Because the printer is too small. Yeah, that's what I was saying. This is me overcoming the size limitations. I mean, I did, as a good art school student, there's always justifications, and I did sort of like the idea of, there's this kind of organic tiling that people do use for, the source of this is that fake flagstone you'll see in like Sports Authority stores or Olive Garden, these kind of tiled. So that's the logic used to kind of hide the seamed quality of fake stone. So I was giving myself the same luxury, but it was a solution born out of limitation. And this is just the visual information that was wrapped around the 3D model. This is an installation at Kansas Gallery. And this is, I did, as part of a larger show, I covered a wall in 2x4s and then wrapped them in fake Tyvek wrapping. And it was sort of this absurdist, fetishist gesture that, that rather than just using Tyvek as it's intended, it's actually not Tyvek, it's vinyl. I would wrap each stud individually and expose them and then hang work on top of them. So it was meant to be this kind of synesthesic response to traditional, conventional architectural moves. And these are also 3D prints on top of it. And the idea was that it would sort of be, it would be taking all the correct logic but applying it in such a way that became kind of absurdist. Although some people did ask if I was going to fix the wall, which broke my heart. These are some 3D prints that I also had on the show. These are scans of 2x4s with different building logos imprinted on them. So I was sort of thinking about the way that often logos can precede even our understanding of what a thing is. We see the brand of the sheetrock or other things before we know what it's actually constituted of. So this says Formica on it. And these are projecting out of the wall. Another development in my work came along when I started getting more excited about CNC carving. And I owe a lot to Michael DeLucia, who's in the audience, who's a real CNC master, who taught me a lot about this and helped me with projects. Hi, Mike. But it's true. It was really a pretty expansive and continues to be expansive conversation around this. And 3D CNC carving was interesting for a variety of reasons. You can use a lot of the same data that you would for a 3D print, but of course you can work at a much greater scale. And you can also use a much greater range of materiality. And so those are two things I sort of got really excited about, is this ability to scale up and get a more diversity of things in play. So just to walk you through how one of these is made briefly, this is a photo I took of a plastic garage wall made to look like wood, which is just the kind of thing that gets me excited. And I also liked that it was like an X, as sort of a do not enter. And a height map was made from this, where I created texture, and then it was carved out and printed on using a flatbed printer again. And so, weird things start to happen. One of the biggest refrains I get is you have to be there in person. The work often is hard to photograph accurately, but there are things like the shadows dipping down, the highlights being raised, and there's just sort of some strange textural things that start to happen from the computer's understanding of the lights and darks. You can see the bricks, or the dark areas are dug inward. This is a ventilation duct. This is a scene with a sidewalk. And so one of the first shows where I was able to explore this in more detail was with a show in Paris I did at Gallery Pact. And this is sort of an installation shot where I did a vinyl wall wrap and a variety of CNC pieces. It was also paired with a photograph by Aaron Siskind. And the gallery does this a lot. They ask artists to bring in like a thinker or another artist who they feel is aligned with their work as a way to kind of set things off, I guess. And I chose Siskin because I thought he was someone who was interesting in the way he was using photography as a sort of abstraction tool through cropping and proximity. But also, our outputs were so different. You know, mine are much larger and tactile, and his are kind of classical, small, and black and white. But I also like the connection that I was using black and white info to create dimension, whereas for him, it was a way to suggest it visually. This is a piece on clear plexiglass of a reflection in a car window of a building. And so the car window parts are carved on the front, and then the imagery is printed on the back. So the window is both kind of literally itself and also a support for an image. It's a little detail. This is a piece of construction hoarding, you know, also on plexiglass. So the front is carved in texture and the windows popping out, and the reflection is all part of the image. Flatbed printer. So it's basically like a conveyor belt. Oh. Yeah, that's how all of these are made in terms of the imagery. This was a wall vinyl wrap. And you know, briefly on this one, this was something I started to get more excited about as a way to introduce scale and proportion into installations without, you know, making a big sculpture. There's something I sort of liked about the elegance of wrapping a wall with an image. And so this is a photograph I found on the internet of a house in construction. You know, it's this big, and so when it was blown up to life size, it's incredibly fuzzy and low res, which is sort of nice because it's this long, thin gallery, and as you walk closer, the image kind of falls apart. And I also liked that it was on this angled wall, so the perspective was in conflict with the imagery, or with the architecture rather. And finally, you know, hanging these brick pieces on it was a sort of tongue-in-cheek about the proper sequence of building, where you hang the cladding after the styrofoam, but of course, you know, there's a lot of mistakes. Another piece was these 3 doors, and this is based on a photograph of one of these plastic Home Depot doors. And in each case, it's just raw plywood that's been carved. But the proportions stay the same, but the scale grows, and then also the image gets cropped. So as it gets bigger, it crops in and gets rougher. And I was very much interested in this sort of sensation we all know intuitively of the zoom in by hand, but trying to give that a bodily presence in a space. And I also liked the way that in this case the plywood really became almost illusionistic and photographic. There's all these gradients and layering that goes on. This was on a sheet of Corian, and so in this one, the Corian is completely flat, whereas the area around it is carved, and this is just all printed information. So again, you know, it's sort of hard to, until you're right on top of it, to get a sense of where there's dimension or flatness. And the pattern is sort of cutting across both. This is an installation at the Armory Art Fair with Lyles and King, where I was doing something similar with the vinyl, sort of doing an inverted perspective inward. So the iPhone case on the ground, blown up to, you know, body size, which I sort of like that surreal element of photography, its ability to kind of give, you know, a sense of tactility or a sense of phenomenology that's disorienting, while still retaining the facts of the image. And this is before it was printed, just to give you a sense. So I'm often, you know, it's a sheet of blue plexiglass that's been carved and then printed on. Similarly, this is a big sheet of wood with a mirror embedded in it. This is pre-printing. So the white is just left as the image substrate. This is an installation at Art Brussels. Again, just sort of, I liked the sort of oversized building. You know, it was 25 feet by 12 feet, so it was big, but it was still way too small. This is before the piece was printed. So in this case, I was leaving some areas raw and sort of letting the wood be its own image, and then letting the other areas be photographic. This is a more recent show at Super Dakota in Brussels as well, and these are all CNC pieces. You know, when I have solo shows, I try to often do something specific to the site. And so this was a window piece where the interior is sort of whitewashed, in the way that a lot of buildings in both New York and Europe are. And then there's an image on the outside, which I'll show you. But I feel like, one of the goals I always have is to make fairly discrete objects that hopefully, are porous in the way they cause associations when you leave the space. And so, that hence the specific subject matter, but also an interest I have in situating things in such a way that they interact with the space around them, even though it's not maybe a full-blown installation in the traditional sense. This is the view from outside. So it's this classic New York green construction fence, and I liked it a lot with, this very early 20th century facade of the gallery. It looked pretty real too, which was nice.
Did you get a sense that people there were familiar with those? For us here, it's like
Yeah. I didn't get a good enough poll, which I should have. I mean, I feel like all the people at the gallery knew because they go to New York a lot, right? Would the average person on the street notice anything in the window is another question. It's a good question, and one I informally polled. Like most people I talked to knew, but I think they were primed to know, right? Because they'd been here, yeah.
Sometimes when I travel, I get like focused on how things are, basic things are so different in another place. So I wonder,
Yeah.
is that like import of that material?
I bet people who hadn't been to New York would not know that association. I think they would get, if they were paying attention at all, the sort of thinness of it, that it was working the way it was supposed to visually, but it didn't have any substance.
But they might think it was special, you know what I mean?
Meaning, what do you mean by special?
Like for us, it's mundane. For them,
Right.
it might be like, an asterisk.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that would be nice. I would like that, Yeah, I mean, I think I was much more interested in presenting it in Europe than I would have been here. I thought, I mean, that was again, I realized it might just be a joke for me or something funny for me, but I liked the idea that I was bringing in, a New York construction fence to a show in Europe. But yeah, it is a good question in terms of the average person. And they don't use them over there that I saw. They're all like those chain links stuck into concrete at the bottom. Yeah. I've done one or two multiples, but they're typically singular, yeah. There's just a little detail. This one has some inlays. One of the things I was exploring with these was laying multiple materials inside each other. So this has a plexiglass inlay within a white, so clear plexiglass that's double-sided in its printing, and then flat white that's printed just on the front. In this case, the bars are raised in separate inlays where the shadow is flat. This is the before printing, so you get some sense of the dimensionality and carving. I was also, experimenting more with the textural range of the carving. That's pre-insertion of the arrow. I sort of liked it on its own. This is one of the pieces being carved. And this is the final work. And so I'm doing things like playing with orientation and the scale of the carving as a way to kind of add. Again, I thought of, for me, the router's interesting in the same way that it's a little bit of a deferred gesture. It's standardized, but it's, there's an intensity to it. So it has both a sense of, physical force, but also, I think, a little bit of like a remove to it for that reason. This was all on one big sheet of plexiglass, black plexiglass with an inlay for the telephone pole. It's a building turned sideways. And then this is the last rounds of images I want to show you from my most recent show, which is currently up at Lyles and King. And these are just some process shots, and also maybe to talk about what I see as a little bit of a cyclical return. If I thought of my last few shows as being more sculptural, I was interested in pushing the verb of painting in this show. And the reasons for that are maybe not worth untangling at the moment, but it was definitely an intuitive sense that it was something I wanted to come back to and something I felt was ready to be explored again. So this show was largely vacuum forms with some carvings, but this is how they often start off, where there are multiple photos printed on one sheet. One of the things I was exploring was sort of double-sided printing and opacity and transparency. Again, I think of as, in their origins, my mind, very painterly at least. So, some things would be backed with white ink, so they'd really be matte and flat, and others would be printed on the back, so they'd be transparent. And I was really trying to play up the the sort of possible dimensionality in this plastic. This gives you a sense of when they're stacked on top of each other, so what happens. This also gave me a lot of ideas for future pieces. This also gives you some sense. So the opaque area, there's a few pieces stacked on top of each other, so the opaque areas are all on the surface, and the transparencies you can see through because they're translucent. This is another video I don't think I have to show you. And then this is some installation shots. The colors, my colors are pretty keyed up, but these are even more keyed up just for the record. They seem a little more bright, but they're pretty bright. So it's a series of vacuum forms and some carvings, but also these two columns are a site-specific sculpture. And my thought that what they are is MDF that has been built and then covered in a vinyl wrap of photos of the gallery floor. The gallery owner tore the floor up with a jackhammer because he wanted to remove tiles, which was, if anyone, Mike's smiling because he saw it. It was possibly suicidal in the long term. I don't know how much dust he inhaled, but it also, struck me as some sort of show of his temperament. But for my purposes too, it seemed nicely aligned with the work. This kind of gouged mark making and this sort of floor that I could extrude out into physical space and sort of invert its gravity. And I like the idea too of these columns. Being spatial interrupters, that they would, as much as they weren't maybe sculptures with a capital S, they were sculptural in the experience of the space. You'd be walking around them, navigating, they'd be interrupting your view, and being an active thing within the space of mostly flat work. One of the more ironic things has been how few people even notice them. I hadn't factored in that they might be invisible, but they are for about 75% of the audience, which is sort of a disappointment, but also has been very interesting to me as a sort of reminder of what can get unnoticed or made invisible, and what how you can draw attention to things. It was sort of it's been a good sociological study, or maybe not sociological, but behavioral. So yeah, a lot of people I have to tell them that they were not always there, and that they're not made of concrete. And yeah, most of these images are, sort of in line with what I've been describing, in the sense of, being, in some ways I was embracing more this unrecognizability of some of these, of them being more abstract, but they often have elements of the nameable, so there are cigarette butts and leaves, and then also, some of the signage is explicit in this case. These are actually signs from Brussels, which sort of goes to your question a little bit, Mike, that you brought up, where I have to take the inverse poll, what people, if anything, recognize about these. I mean, they're sort of universal symbols, which is why I took them, but they were also specific to that environment. But I was thinking of these as being somewhat related to the infrastructural marks. They direct your body or tell you where to go. And these are carvings. One of the other changes I made with these group is they're largely hand carved with the router. So the circle here, let's see if I can get a side shot. You can see the circle is CNC'd out. It's a tracing of the red circle, but then it's been shifted down and printed in a different place. But then all the textural marks are made by hand, and I was sort of interested in bringing some of the expressive qualities I'd been using in the vacuum forms back into the carving. And so I think this often happens where one solution feeds into another, or one process shows you the way into a different one. Also, one thing that's a little hard to communicate in photos, but you can see, is there's an offset between the front and back of the photo, so the image is sort of separated out onto two surfaces and a thick sheet of material, and so it's sort of, you have to move around it to get the image to line up properly, if you even want to. So all the orange is printed on the back. You can see a little bit from the side, or from there. You can see there's this gap here where all the colored areas are in the back, and the more neutral colors are on the front. This is another one from Brussels. This is all clear too, so that in some places the plexi's been left completely raw and exposed. And I'm also building up surfaces here. This is an extra piece built on top. So I was interested in the image being whole and unmodified, but my sculptural moves kind of adding dimensionality to it. You can see that's printed on the front and the back. is it. Thank you.
Any questions? Anyone?
How's it going?
I was wondering, are the images that you're using in your most recent show, are they 3D scans or are they like straight images
Just
from a
im-
digital camera?
Just images from a digital camera, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm doing basic things like modifying color a little bit or increasing increasing contrast, but they're all straight photos, which has sort of been thus far kind of a useful constraint. You know, I've sort of focused more on what I can do to them materially while using the frame of the photo as a kind of template or a ready-made element.
I was wondering about how you, like, when you have to photograph these ultimately after they've been presented, how do you feel about that as a constraint or as an opportunity?
It's a good question. It's usually a frustration. You know, I think the reality, and that's a poll I would like to take among other artists, but I'm constantly being told, oh, you don't really get it till you're there in person. And that's led me to take more detail shots, and I actually have started taking little videos of them. But yeah, I think it's, maybe your question is a good prompt. I could think about ways to make it more interesting for myself, but as it stands, it's currently kind of annoying more than anything. Because yeah, I mean, the irony is they're photos that are given dimension, and then in photography they're flattened back out again, and so there's sort of, yeah, it gets a little lost.
Back where they started or something?
Yeah, I think they often do end up back where they started, and I think with each go-round, I'm looking for ways to make it more obvious. I think often you have to, which I know is conversations we've had too, is ways to make things more legible for people. Because as the column is case in point, people really need to be often given more clues.
I have a question about what seems to be like this ease of mobility from material to material represented in a way, and I'm just kind of, which I think is really an incredible aspect to your work. But one thing that I constantly think about is that, as we potentially move towards this kind of singularity of production, in the sense that what might eventually come, maybe not in decades or many decades, the ability to print any material, or the idea to be able to have a one-to-one fidelity in terms of produce material as material, not just represented.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something that you think about, and what that might eventually mean in terms of production from an artistic standpoint, or otherwise?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's tricky in a few ways, because a few thoughts I have, which none of which are conclusive, but just hearing you say that, it reminds me a little bit of when people say, well, soon we'll be able to clone our bodies and no one will die, and I think, well, the rich won't die. And I think the production you're describing sounds like it might be, at least in the short term, pretty inaccessible. That's
Much of that is already apparent. A lot of those techniques to be able to print metal and things like that have existed for
yeah.
decades, but have only been accessible to government, defense, or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. It's already, your question sort of already exists, right? And I think, yeah, there's both a completely pragmatic response, which is like you work within the constraints you have budget-wise and sponsorship-wise and all of that. I also, I've always suspected, and again, this is one of those things where I check myself because I'm aware of it as a generational philosophy, but I've always sort of suspected that you need to make interesting art, you have to add some friction to what is often a streamlined process for some commercial purpose. I think it's not always true, but it's generally true, right? So, when you describe a singularity or a seamlessness, my suspicion is I would need to throw a wrench in something in order to make it interesting for myself and maybe for other people too.
Right. I mean, I think that ultimately, as you're saying, I mean, there's, social economic kind of constraints there, but I mean, I guess I asked the question more in terms of maybe shaded from my perspective in terms of the power of what material presence is, and when eventually that might break down.
I see. I
guess
see.
that's maybe kind of more.
I mean, I've never been interested, for instance, in making, thus far at least, in making something that lives online. It just, I have nothing against it, but it hasn't gotten my imagination going. So from that perspective, I certainly, at this stage, and I suspect as long as I'm in a body, I'll want something that affects my body, That's my suspicion. But again, things change fast, so I'm not 100% sure of that, just so far. Yeah.
And any other questions?
Is there a material that you like the most or you find most intuitive of the ones you've been playing around with?
That's a good question. I think it changes. It's a good question, but I do think, I remember when ebooks first came out thinking like, this is great. And I tried reading some ebooks with all good intentions, and I realized the lack of touch somehow hurt comprehension. And I've had a little bit of the same arc with a lot of this work I've done, where as fascinating as some virtual environments are, sort of like what I was saying a second ago, I find that if there's not some degree of touch, no romance. In fact, I'm almost reluctant to say it. I always was sort of fantasizing about the push-button art object, but I've found that the sort of imaginative cycles slow down or get shortchanged. So I think I've gotten really into the carving lately, especially partly either whether that's digital or by hand, just because there's such an apparent tactility to that, and also an immediacy where you can just go right into it. So it changes, but I do think that the larger arc is things that can involve hand building for sure. And I do see, at least in the near future, my work going in that direction of more elements where I'm maybe literally painting in ways that are visible or building by hand. I feel like one thing I would add to that, the other thing that's been interesting for me so far is the photograph has served as a sort of envelope that will allow for a lot of those manipulations to happen while still maintaining some distance that feels important to just the affect I want it to have. I want it to have some contradiction. And so far, the use of some of these photographic means have been have for me at least been a satisfying way to do that.
Anyone else? I also have a question. What is the relation of the light for your pieces? Because it's a lot of they're all mostly 3D, and we've been talking about how you choose certain color to be in the front or in the back.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them were kind of confusing because the color that was kind of representing maybe graffiti was at the back rather than supposed to be like in the front, right?
Mm-hmm.
On the actual piece. And did you ever play with a light?
Light meaning actual light?
Actual light.
I didn't include a slide. I did an early show. I put a piece in a window, and I'm always to a much lesser degree, that piece in Brussels had a little bit of that where it would cast shadows. I haven't yet, mounted these on a light box. Is that sort of what you're getting at? Or something like that, where there'd be like an artificial light source?
I was more curious, I noticed that you've been using just regular light in the gallery,
Mm-hmm.
but did you ever try to place light in a weird direction
I
that
see.
creates shadow in a way that, I don't know, maybe make this piece a little more familiar for people, or
Mm-hmm.
a little kind of different, will bring different look?
Yeah, this is something that's been suggested to me. And I'm smiling at someone in the audience about that. And the answer is I haven't, and it's probably something worth thinking about. It's the honest answer is probably it's not an area that's intuitive for me. But I think there's ideas there. What I have resisted so far, and pretty intentionally, is the sort of light box effect. Just because I felt like that would get to a place maybe that was, for lack of a better word, cheesy or too close to other commercial design in a way that felt a little goofy or theatrical, if that's even the right word. Maybe theatrical is not the right word. Maybe like retail is the right word. It'd feel too retail in a goofy way. But I think what you're bringing up is something worth exploring that I haven't dug into yet. But the one thing I have tried that I liked and would like to do more of is natural lighting situations, like putting pieces in windows where the light passes through and changes throughout the day. And I've done a little bit of that.
And how do you choose what color is gonna go in the front or what's at the back? Because this I found really interesting. Like, for example, the graffiti that was at the back rather than in the front.
Yeah. It's sort of, maybe the fact you found it interesting explains one reason, just sort of playing with expectations a little bit. It's also sometimes a color or a spatial issue. If I feel like that color would, in the case of the double-sided prints, it would look richer or more interesting coming from behind rather than in front. But I think by and large, yeah, it's sort of a way to introduce paradoxical or contradictory space in, just so it sort of slows down or, creates depth where there shouldn't be any.
Anyone else? No. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate it. Thank you.